Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever this conversation finds you. I am Travis Gray, and today we are transforming with our guest, Rabbi Matthew Ponak. Matthew is a spiritual counselor. He is an ordained rabbi, as I mentioned. He is an ordained rabbi. Has a master's degree in contemplative religion from Naropa University. He has a new book out now called Embodied Kabbalah, called the Embodied Kabbalah, Embodied Kabbalah, Jewish Mysticism for all people. So he brings to us the wisdom of the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. And I fumbled all of that, but how are you, Matthew?
It's okay. I'm good. They're difficult words to pronounce, these Hebrew words transliterated into English. Yeah, so embodied Kabbalah is how I pronounce it. But I'm doing well. I'm really happy to be here and to meet you, Travis.
Absolutely. Why is Kabbalah? Why is that spelled so many different ways?
Well, there's two ways to answer that. One is it's a Hebrew word, and anytime it's going to be transliterated, there's kind of different ways that one could. Mm-hmm. So the first letter in Hebrew, the kuf, could be a Q, but it could also, the sound is a K sound. So it could be a K or it could be a C. Just like Hanukkah is spelled different ways. It's because people haven't really decided the best way to transliterate it into English. So that's one reason. But the other reason is actually you can tell what type of Kabbalah it is based on how it's spelled. So the original Kabbalah, of course, was in Hebrew, surfaced in the Middle Ages. Yeah. But about 150, 200 years after it came into being, I guess probably closer to 200 years, Christian Kabbalah started. It was something that was learned first by a particular Christian mystic. And he started this almost, I don't know how intentional he was, but an accidental movement. Kabbalah with a C is how it started to be spelled. And then the Theosophists at the end of the 1800s, sort of like early British New Age, British American New Age, but like late 1800s, they changed it again and sort of adopted Christian Kabbalah and made it more universal. And in my historical opinion, did a great disservice to the telling of its origins. But they started spelling with a Q. And so today, generally speaking, Jews who are teaching Kabbalah in English are writing it with a K. And if you see it with a Q, those are the Theosophists or New Age more broadly sometimes. And then with a C is Christian Kabbalah.
Well, that is really fascinating. I did not know that Theosophists had any kind of connection exactly. I know Theosophists just generally interested in things, but I didn't know that about the Q, the differences in the Q and the K and the and all of that. So the Kabbalah is for people that aren't that don't know, what is the Kabbalah?
So first of all, I usually wouldn't say the Kabbalah. I would just say Kabbalah.
Kabbalah.
Just like we might say nature. Nature is beautiful, right? We wouldn't have to say the nature is beautiful. That's how most people in my circle, I guess, would describe it and refer to it. But essentially, Kabbalah is a Jewish mystical movement, which was first written down in the 13th century in Provence, France, and then soon after in Spain, in Castile. It is a ladder between our world and the infinite. So Kabbalah was surfacing at a time when the dominant theology in Judaism was really about, oh, we have nothing in common with God. And this sort of magical, mysterious universe that had populated the Jewish imagination before that had kind of been erased. And now a big philosopher came along and said, oh, we don't have anything in common with God. You know, God is so beyond. And one way of understanding Kabbalah is it said, well, yeah, let's call that God you're referring to the infinite, but there's all of this stuff between us and that. It's a whole spiritual realm. And that was a way of re-enchanting, you could say, the mystical journey, but also this ladder, which became known as the Sephirot, was what I believe came from people's experiences of spirituality at that time. And so it was first written down at that moment. It could have been older. There's actually no way of knowing. But beginning in the 13th century, Kabbalah came on the scene. And since then, it went through many different transformations and evolutions, and fleshing it out and changing it and making it more explicitly experiential to our day, where people are sharing it in new ways again.
I love how enthusiastic you are, like you're really in your element talking about the Kabbalah. So how did you get started on this journey? How did you become a rabbi? How did you get interested in contemplative religion? How did that happen for you?
So a brief history of my journey.
Yeah.
It's written in the preface of my book, Embodied Kabbalah. But what started out for me, I was raised Jewish, but in a relatively cultural way, you could say. It wasn't, let's say, I wasn't traditionally practicing in my household growing up very much. We did a few kind of things. I went to a Jewish day school, so I learned some Hebrew, learned some history. You know, I had a bar mitzvah, an initiation right into adulthood, but it was really a cultural thing. There weren't a whole lot of people, let's say, getting drunk on God at prayer services and those kinds of things around me. But when I was a teenager, I had kind of a budding interest in spirituality, but no real container for that. It was just like a philosophy, and I'm interested in this kind of music and those kinds of things. And I ended up on some level like stumbling into this Jewish spiritual class for teenagers taught from an Orthodox Jewish teacher. And she was my first exposure to anything really overtly spiritual and experiential. And it was just tied together with Judaism. And that was my spiritual opening as a teenager, happened simultaneously with my introduction to Orthodox Judaism, which I can define, more at length if you'd like, but it's essentially people who are practicing a particular understanding of Jewish law and how that shows up in the world. And with, fairly, let's say, trying to hold on to and relate to a pre-modern belief system. And everyone in the modern age, we're all kind of finding our way through. And so Orthodox Judaism is one particular approach to that.
Right.
So I went like really enthusiastically on this mission and this journey through Orthodox Judaism and spirituality. I ended up in a seminary in Israel when I was 18. So I traveled through Europe when I graduated high school and found my way to Israel. And I was learning very intensively. And it was sort of singing and dancing on the one hand, but also rigorous study and prayer. And I didn't know what it meant to be grounded at that point in my life. No one had taught me, and I didn't even know there was such a thing. I didn't know there's such a thing as a spiritual emergency, for example. And lo and behold, I wasn't sleeping much. I wasn't eating much. I was praying and learning all day, and something just broke within me. And I had what could be deemed a spiritual emergency. I didn't even know that term, but it was a very difficult experience, very shattering. And I ended up back in my hometown of Calgary, sort of picking up the pieces for the next few years. Eventually, two things were happening. One, I was in university and I was learning about religious history and Jewish biblical history, but in this critical perspective from the academic mindset. And it was really picking apart what I had understood as good and holy and things that I believed in. And simultaneously, I encountered transpersonal psychology. And this was now finally giving me a framework to understand what had happened to me at the seminary, how it's possible to be overwhelmed by the light, that it's not just, let's do bliss forever and ever. And so I started getting separated from my own tradition. And I was sort of, if you could say, a universalist, and my religion or my spiritual path was transpersonal psychology. I found so much beauty there. So I ended up going on this, I did this degree program at Naropa. I sort of wanted to go, and I'm going to be a universalist. I'm going to learn contemplative religions. And I thought I was going to be an academic, and I was going to, but at Naropa, I could get a master's, but also do it experientially. So I was going to kind of fill in the gaps of my own learning and help me on that process. But the universe had another plan. And as I went down there, it was only a few weeks, and I ended up having a series of these calling experiences where it felt to me as though, to my surprise, from beyond, I was hearing these really deep messages that I'm going to be a rabbi. And it was so shocking to me at that moment. But I talked to my teachers, I talked to elders. I was really trying to be intentional about it. And after 5 years, 2 years at Naropa and then another few years in Boulder, I decided to take the plunge and just, I want to try this. I want this to be part of my lifestyle. I'm going to go to rabbinical school. I moved out to Boston. At that point, I was married. I had a son, very young son. And over the course of those 5 years of rabbinical school, things started to come together and it started to make sense. And what I discovered there was a Jewish mystical language of embodiment, that what I thought wasn't present in Judaism with spiritual groundedness, very explicitly, it was there. It was just sometimes untranslated or not gathered together. And so my book, Embodied Kabbalah, is that culmination of that journey. It is a Jewish mystical teaching that is about embodiment and groundedness and the balance between spirituality and regular life.
Right. Yeah, I love that it is bringing a pragmatic, it's like making the spiritual practical in the real world. It is really fascinating that you said you did not know that it was possible to be overwhelmed by the light. I work for the Spiritual Emergence Network USA as the community outreach manager. So I do know. Did you fall into the work of Emma Bragdon at that time?
Possibly. Did she have a book called Helping People with Spiritual Problems?
Yeah, something like
based
that.
on her PhD dissertation. That book might be right behind me here. I don't know if I can grab it.
Oh yeah, that's exactly what it's called, and it is.
Yep,
right
I know that book.
me.
I know Farther
That's
Shores by Ivan Kasson. Yeah, I have that book on my shelf behind me, and I know the work of Ivan Kasson. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Farther Shores really was an aid to me at that time, and Spiritual Emergency by Stanislav Grof, of course.
Absolutely, I got him too. So that's beautiful that you ran into transpersonal psychology. You ran into or attracted or brought in something came to you to get to fall in place of the right tools with transpersonal psychology, emergency at Naropa, having that experiential to fill in the gaps, like you were saying. That's really beautiful. What does the Kabbalah? So I did a little researching on. I have a couple of things here. So the Zohar, the Book of Splendor, is that what you were saying, that it was nobody knows when, but that's when it was introduced?
So the Zohar was one of the earliest books, but it wasn't the first one. Now, what the Zohar did, which was really special, and part of what made it so beloved and prolific throughout all these eras. I mean, right behind me is the whole Zohar translated into English by someone at Berkeley, Daniel Matt. It's a really amazing translation with commentary. And what the Zohar did was it took that ladder system that had been experienced, again, I don't want to say with certainty, that had been manifested in some way, that ladder system between us and the divine realm and the infinite, and it read it into Jewish texts and teachings. So it saw the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, as a metaphor for that ladder. Yeah. So Abraham, the character of Abraham, was no longer just Abraham. He was the chariot upon which loving kindness rode into the world. Yeah. And the creation of the universe in the book of Genesis wasn't just day 1, day 2, day 3, that actually this was the manifestation of the spiritual realm as well, concealed with this more ordinary writing. But the Zohar says, these are not just stories. If these were stories, why would we even read it? There are better stories in the world. It's very bold in saying that, by the way. And it says these are actually mysterious secrets that are being clothed by the words. So the Zohar, like any great Jewish classic, any text that has really made it in the history of Judaism, was a combination of something new, something that was needed or really relevant, and what came before. And it was a union between those two things, which allowed it not to just last for 1 or 2 generations, but for dozens up until this day. And the Zohar is exploding on the scene again right now. So that's the formula that the Zohar makes use of, which is actually very much in keeping with a lot of the great texts of Jewish history.
Wow, that's very interesting. So I did have like an old Zohar. I have not read too much into it, but what you just said about the riding in on the chariot, I read in this one too, the Wisdom of the Jewish Mystics by Alan Untermann. I work at my university in the library, so I get a lot of these really awesome book donations, and that's where all of these books have come from. Is
That's
these
great.
like old spiritual psychologists will have passed away, and their donations get brought to the university. So I've collected the books from that, and this idea of the chariot is an archetypal idea in the spiritual rhetoric and spiritual language, because it comes up in it comes up in the Bhagavad Gita as well. So can you say a little bit more about what is that divine chariot?
So this is
What
where,
is the vehicle that people are riding in on peace and happiness and joy?
would it be okay, Travis, if I shared my screen?
Sure.
Does that work for you?
Yeah,
And
that
anyone
works
who's,
for
I
me.
guess, listening on audio could find the YouTube video later,
Yeah.
because there's a particular teaching
Mhm.
in my book that describes this process. And in truth, there's many ways of understanding this, of course. This is sort of one of the things that rabbis are quite good at articulating, that there's so many ways of viewing any one particular teaching. And the Merkavah is, interestingly, something that has become really common and outstanding in non-Jewish Kabbalah.
Mhm.
So what is often seen in meditation forums, where you have a Star of David, right, a six-pointed star, but it's three-dimensional. People will do meditations where the point is above their head
Yeah.
on one triangle, and then there's an overlapping triangle and goes to beneath their feet. And that, I was just reading a graphic novel called The Incal that wasn't written by Jews, to my knowledge, and the Merkavah it wasn't even called that, but it was a central
Yeah.
element of the whole story. And so you'll find that, and that's what some people think of. It's a geometric shape.
Yeah.
There's Kabbalah that also, well, Jewish mysticism. I'm using Kabbalah in the more technical sense. Sometimes people say Kabbalah and they mean all of Jewish mysticism, which is fine.
Mhm.
And there is a pre-medieval or a late classical period. We're talking somewhere between maybe the years 0 and 800 or 900. There is a form of Jewish mysticism called Merkavah mysticism. And Merkavah means a chariot.
Yeah.
And it essentially is an astral traveling tradition where people are, according to these sparse records, leaving their bodies, and they're going into different realms. And in each realm, there's sort of different gateways they're passing through. And sometimes the gateways require a code or a password, but the whole point is to get to the very pinnacle, where you're either going to be glimpsing the divine throne or getting in touch with an angel called Metatron, who's going to reveal divine secrets. And that is called like chariot mysticism. But a lot of that traces itself back to the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, which is in the first chapter, he has this vision of this throne and this chariot. Even though the word Merkavah isn't mentioned there, it's often seen. This is sort of like the origins of this. And it's a particular vision. Anyone can look this up, by the way, on Google and see the book of Ezekiel in English. And
This is like
it's
the
a very,
sacred. This is like the sacred geometric shapes and things like this. It has that connection. Is that correct?
you will find that,
Yeah.
but that, honestly, I've seen way more of that outside of Jewish Kabbalah.
You sure?
I don't know its origins in Jewish Kabbalah, in fact. And it could be one of these things that was interpreted and changed based on contact with Christianity or theosophy. I don't know. But that is a very common thing you'll find. But I honestly couldn't tell you the Jewish origins of that. I've never seen it.
It's really interesting when you use the angel of Metatron. I think Metatron is another shape. It's another the Merkabah. It's another shape. It's another like another three-pointed star or what have you.
Yeah, and so but Metatron in early rabbinic writings from thousands of years ago is an angel, and it's probably of Greek origin. It has like a Greek name.
Yeah.
So just to say, like, things are changing. If you see Metatron drawn as a shape, that's someone's interpretation, probably much more recently.
Yeah.
But it doesn't go back to the earliest Jewish teachings on it, certainly. It's another tradition coming in. So for me, it's important to distinguish. I think at the end of the day, if it's helpful, and people are learning and growing from it, that's the most important thing. But I'm more cautious now than I used to be, because I learned through actually interacting and reading articles from an Israeli academic named Boaz Huss, and he's an expert on sort of Theosophic Kabbalah, and basically Madame Blavatsky, who started this, one of the two founders of Theosophic Society, she said that the Jews had corrupted and appropriated Kabbalah from the Greeks and the Egyptians, which is an entirely fabricated history.
Mm-hmm.
And she was claiming to return to the original pure Kabbalah. And it was basically anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And it was relegating the originators and the carriers of the tradition to these corruptors of it. It was really nasty. So when I have a bit more caution around saying kind of what is true Kabbalah and like, it's all good. Well, it is all good. But if people are starting to say, well, we really invented this and you didn't, it's like, that's where you get into the realm of appropriation. And it's a bit, I don't know, troubling, as I'm sure you could imagine. For someone to be doing that to one's tradition. I'm noticing I actually don't have permission to share a file. And if you're open, or to share a screen, if you're open to allowing me access, say, well, if not, it's all good. I can just sort of give over the teaching.
I'm not seeing the ability to do that. So I think we'll just.
Okay, well, I will read this teaching to you.
Yeah,
it's from 1700s Jewish mystic who writes profound things about, and it's always going to be this blend between the mystical message and the symbolic language of Judaism, which is really biblical often, or early rabbinic, that those are the symbols they're drawing on to articulate these messages. So this is talking about Abraham as a chariot. In truth, the quality of Abraham, our father, peace be upon him, is the attribute of loving kindness in its proper place. The world of love is a clear world. Thoughts cannot comprehend the nature of its dimensions and goodness at all. Indeed, he directed, meaning Abraham directed, the fullness of his stature to serve the Creator with great love until his whole body was made a chariot for the qualities of love. He made God and the dissemination of this quality in the mouths of humans commonplace. According to the sages, Abraham said to God, in the past, God was called God of the heavens, and now I have habituated your name in the mouths of humans, and therefore God is called God of the earth. In other words, Abraham showed every human being that the divine attribute of loving kindness extends even into physicality. So Abraham in Jewish mythology is understood as this paradigm shifter, a bringer of love. And so there is this world of love with this teaching points to, but it's really beyond. Yeah, it's like, you could say the world of love is where everything is love, perhaps, or maybe it's just another realm where everything is love. And what Abraham was doing is he aligned himself with this quality while remaining embodied. And it says he filled his body with it. His whole body became a chariot for love. And so when he starts connecting with people, right, this paradigm shifter, I'm saying this is mythology. I do not believe this is history, but you can understand how it's like a guru or a really profound teacher, or just someone who's so compassionate, a mother, those kinds of things, they can actually bring divine qualities into our world. That every emotion, in a sense, has a spark of divinity in it. But what would it be like to get to the root of our compassion? What would it be like to get to the root of our love, or the root of our boundaries? That's where when you start getting into this ladder system of Kabbalah, like there is such a thing as a holy quality of boundaries, or a holy quality of action. And when we do these kinds of, I mean, there's many different paths towards that, but let's say prayer is a very common one in the tradition. But today, I think it's wonderful to be doing embodiment practices and meditating on our sensations. And sometimes we'll go from a physical feeling into something that's maybe a memory, but sometimes in that process, we can actually start getting into something that doesn't feel mundane, let's say, or even subconscious. We get into a realm that's beyond that. And that's that process. And then we can live it. And that's what it means in this sense to be a Merkava, to be a chariot, that we can connect with divine realities and actually bring them into the world and into our lives.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the transformative practices that you facilitate for others, practices of contemplation and meditation, in a synonymous way of that contemplative tradition, contemplating on even the passage that you just read. The one aspect of it that caught my attention was that the world of thought, the world of the mind, the world of thought, is clear, but it is
Well, the world of love is clear, and thought cannot grasp it. The world of love is clear, and thought cannot grasp it.
okay. It seemed I like listened to it a little differently, but it seems to me that the world where all of those thoughts are happening is clear, but the thoughts are kind of like clouding it. The content is clouding it. That starts to fracture everything, and make it not so clear, not so loving, it kind of like pulls you away from being on the chariot.
Yeah, and let me just say, Travis, like whether you were able to like recite this teaching you heard for the first time verbatim or not, what arises in your mind when you hear it, that's Torah study. That's this process. It's actually, it's good to kind of be what they call grounded in the sources or grounded in the text. But Torah study, certainly in the Jewish mystical sense, but also just broadly speaking in the Jewish religion, it's not just memorization of material or these are the 10 rules I need. It's actually it's a sacred practice. So I'm learning this, I'm opening something up, and there's things that are coming into my awareness that aren't literally in the text. And let's go with that. You know what I mean? That's a big part of it. So I want to just honor that. And I feel a little bit bad about like, that's not what it said exactly, but truthfully, it's what it comes to your mind. And the experience of there being something clear and something existent and profound, and you could even say pure. That's a pretty, it's a word I'm careful about, the word pure, but there is something that can be clouded. And in a sense, a lot of the journey, whether it's in a particular moment or over the long term, is about, well, according to one medieval Jewish mystic, it's untying the knots of our soul, he would say. And I tend to translate things literally in these texts, but God isn't a word that everyone likes. I could have said it interpretively, infinite reality or deep reality or those kinds of things, right? And instead of soul, I could say consciousness, but I'm kind of trying to be true to the sources. But just, for you to know and for listeners, these are just words. And really it's pointing towards an existence and a reality and experience. And if the word gets in the way, please just delete that from the program. And
that's so important. What you're saying right there. I have known and sort of said this. I don't even know where I came across this, but that the Hebrew word for I think it was a Hakomi teacher. He was an Israeli Hakomi teacher. Do you know Hakomi as well?
I'm familiar with it, but I'm not a practitioner of it, but I'm aware of the method. Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't exactly sure how it was connected with Judaism, but maybe there was just like a school of a lot of Jewish counselors had came together and had this training in Hakomi, because we had a co-taught Hakomi class. Both people were Jewish, and he had described the word of God as being this word that was not to be uttered, like it's bad luck.
Impronounceable.
Impronounceable.
In fact, people who claim to know how to pronounce it probably don't know what they're talking about. There's actually no way of knowing, because it's not written with vowels, and it's also written with the 4 letters that are written with were also used to indicate, like, basically you could put one of these letters at the end of a word and it would just tell you what the previous vowel was, but it wouldn't actually tell you what sound it makes. So maybe people can pronounce it somewhere. There's sort of all sorts of guesses, but I don't think anyone really knows. It is beyond words, beyond sound, in a lot of ways. Yeah, it's ineffable.
Yeah. Have you can you describe like your experience? Have you read the Torah and had some of these some of these inspired ideas, this studying, just in the way that you were describing to me, that, you know, whatever came up for you, whatever that lesson, that wisdom, whatever was coming through in your interpretation of the words, that if that had if that was a part of the transformative vehicle for the perfection of your personality and the ongoing, you know, growth and development of yourself. Have you had those experiences while reading the Torah?
Or yeah, so Torah, just the word can be used to refer to those first 5 books, but also Torah can be used like the word Dharma in the sense of just the whole body of teachings, right? Like the Dharma is the body of teachings in Buddhism, yeah? And Torah can be like the Torah, but it can also, all of these books behind me on this bookshelf, that's all Torah,
right?
You know what I mean? And they're spanning thousands of years. So I don't mean this to sound grandiose, but the experience of studying Torah, and it's not just for me, it's people who kind of love doing it.
Yeah.
It's every time you do it, you have these insights, right? And it's not that profound, you know what I mean? It doesn't have to be like this mind blowing, you know what I mean? But you're relating to a text regardless of its historical origins, really. And there's so much written about that, and I actually love talking about it, but sometimes getting too into like, where did this really come from, can kind of detract from the learning. So just to put that conversation aside, there's been thousands of years of spiritual energy invested in reading these sources. And it's like you enter into that flow, that consciousness of the learning, and things come up. And so it's almost like, I couldn't even give you one example. I mean, I could kind of like make one up of the kind of thing, but there's so many. It's like, I've been learning Torah in this kind of way for 20 years. And so it's like every time I sit down, it happens. So, and it is the kind of experience that sometimes it can untangle knots, so to speak, but it's also for me at least, a very like epiphany kind of experience. So it's more that I had to spend a lot of time getting grounded and learning how to relate to my emotions so that I wasn't using Torah to bypass what was needing to be looked at. So when I think of untying the knots, so Jewish contemplative practice has changed over history. If you look in the Bible, it's mostly about bringing animals and plants to sacrifice at the temple. I'm not being facetious. That was the main practice. The temple gets destroyed 2000-ish years ago. And what surfaces, the main contemplative practices really are the prayer service, Torah study, and just the way of life, the holiday flow. Like every moment is part of like the Jewish custom, ritual, legal world. And so it was just sort of like, here's your portable temple in a sense. And this was really a diaspora religion. We weren't in the land. But today, that system, all those systems really relied on a view of the world. It wasn't necessary, but many people that observed these vast ritual systems and legal systems, they believed that if there was a reward and punishment system, it was like a direct relationship between us and God. We're good things are going to happen by and large. But the Enlightenment comes along. Yeah, I mean, I don't mean Buddhist Enlightenment, like Hindu Enlightenment. I mean the modern movement. And that really starts to kind of ask some pretty big questions about reward and punishment. Where did these sources come from? What is God anyways? And then the Holocaust happens, and that totally destroys the temple of our belief system, if you will. So in the same way that the physical temple's destruction halted the sacrificial system and started this new form, the destruction of the temple of belief, and because nobody could understand how that anyone could possibly be deserving of that. Like it was inexplainable based on the paradigm that existed. So now there's a new shift happening. And yeah, there's lots of prayer services still, but there's also lots of new things, and where people are finding older sources that kind of give permission for that kind of change, or just saying, I'm modern and I want to do what works. So for me, I do a lot of body-centered meditation, and I lead people through that. It can involve text study. Sometimes it's a great way to kind of generate sort of energy to begin. We're going to do some learning and like, oh, let's feel into the space right now. That's one approach. But it could also be, imagine, like this is a Jewish metaphor for it that I didn't create. It was from a teacher of mine, that the body is like a Torah scroll. And when you look, or a text, when you look at a text, it's not just what's literally there on the surface. Like you gaze into it and something arises from underneath it. So that's the experience of feeling into our bodies, isn't it? That we have a sensation, but oh, wait, there's something underneath that. And now I see an image. And is that image now, that's my verse for interpreting. What's beyond that? And so a lot of the practices that I do in that, certainly one-on-one with students or clients of mine, but also in group, it's very much informed by things like focusing or the diamond approach. I've had teachers who are in that lineage, and it's not that distinct from a lot of other somatic practices. Now, if I do sort of a more sometimes group services that involve movement and certain types of Jewish chanting leading into mystical Jewish poetry, and then a meditation that involves somatics, then you're starting to get into more sort of interacting with the Jewish cultural models around that. But I see Kabbalah as a path which makes an immense amount of sense using somatic practices that you can find in a lot of places today.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I can just imagine the sort of experiences that you're facilitating for groups of people to move through a really incredible experiential process of awakening, even to various degrees in those just having really profound wisdom experiences. Do you think that Viktor Frankl was a Kabbalist?
Certainly not in the technical sense.
Right. Yeah,
You know what I mean?
that
Of
seems
like,
interesting to me.
to my knowledge, he was.
Sorry, that it seems interesting
To my
to me
knowledge, he was
because,
never like citing the sephirotic ladders, right? But
right.
in the sense of him going through hell, you know what I mean, or the dark realms, you know, the Sitra Achra.
Yeah.
He was contending with the demonic and having something really amazing to share at the end of that and to help people. He was following a very universal path that's also articulated in Kabbalah. In the broader sense, I don't know if he even identified as a mystic, but he's certainly inspirational, and he's someone who really can stand in places that most people cannot in terms of his depth of experience and what he was really offering as a result.
Well, he was an early editor of the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. So he
There we go. You know more about him perhaps than I do.
Yeah, so one wonderful person, and you know the whole logos therapy about it's one of my principles that I've adopted is making meaning of things, and it's fascinating how that seems to run very parallel and kind of weaves together all of our conversation, even what you were speaking about in terms of studying Torah and receiving the meaning that is gained from it. That's sort of what he is saying is the process of life. You're making meaning of things in this locos way.
I totally agree with that. I guess I'm cautious with the term Kabbalist again, because there's people right now who say, I remember someone saying to me when I used to live in Boulder, well, I've been through difficulty and now I've come out the other end. So my friend told me that I'm a shaman. And it's like, well, I guess. Yeah. I mean, Viktor Frankl, I hold him in high regard. Like, would he have self-identified as a Kabbalist? I have a feeling he wouldn't have.
Yeah.
So Kabbalah is this universal path, but on some level, one, like, who needs labels? You know what I mean? Like, who needs labels? They get in the way. But also, I think if one were to use the label, it should probably be someone who's also explicitly interacting with the Kabbalistic symbols, you know what I mean, in relation to that path. And you hear when I use the example of someone who self-identifies as a shaman, it's sure, but also not. Yeah. So if Viktor Frankl were alive today, I'd love to hear his take on it. But I will say that I'm also not an expert on Freud. I'm sure you could tell me all sorts of things about Freud I don't know. But the way that he understood dreams is very, to what I know, akin to the way that Jewish people study Torah. And I know there's been a lot written about him, and he had a fairly traditional Jewish upbringing. I think he was trained in these kinds of texts. And, these things kind of like bleed through at the very least, even if it wasn't intentional. And it's also such a universal thing, but it's looking at reality, whether that's a dream, or in this case, the body, or traditionally in Judaism and rabbinic Judaism in the last 2,000 years, the text. and saying there's more here than meets the eye. And how can what I'm going through right now, or with the questions at hand, how can that meet this source, and what arises from that? What lies underneath? And I think there's a lot of that in psychology, which I'm not going to say comes from Judaism, but there's certainly a lot of overlap, and a lot of very important psychological theorists were Jewish. So I think there's probably some cultural influence there. And Carl Jung is one of my favorites, if not my favorite. He was definitely not Jewish, but I really, really appreciate his perspective on a lot of these things. And I know, at least I've heard, perhaps you can correct me, that near the end of his life and career, he was interacting with Kabbalah and had some reference for it, what he was encountering.
I don't know. His big red book, though, there's a lot of fascinating things that can be brought from that, and maybe he was looking at the tree of life and the Kabbalah and all of these things in really cool ways. I'm not sure. Part of the research when I was doing before this conversation, I did find that this one interpreter, one of those books that I showed, they had spoke about the Zohar, sort of almost making a joke a little bit of the difference between the esoteric Jewish mysticism, the mystics, making a joke of the Orthodox Jewish people that are not sort of awake to using the Kabbalah in these ways. And so I'm not sure who this guy was, but
well, it's interesting. The term Orthodox, if he didn't use that term, it would be different than what I was describing as orthodoxy earlier on in this conversation. Orthodox Judaism today is a modern movement. And there's a lot, they were in many ways in Judaism, the preservers of Kabbalah. And anyone back in Spain, they wouldn't have been Orthodox if they're Kabbalists in terms of their thinking, but in terms of their practice, they definitely were. Like the Kabbalists of the Zohar were, as much as they were mystical and innovative, they were also incredibly conservative. They weren't saying we don't need these rituals, and not at all. They were like very much practicing them. In fact, investing them often with extra meaning on all these subtle layers. So that being said, the authors of the Zohar, who, by the way, are claiming, the author, at least, or authors, plural, are claiming that they're actually rabbis living 1,000 years earlier than they were. So that's part of how this kind of makes its way in. This pseudepigraphy is the religious studies term for people who write new things and claim that it's much older. I mean, you'll find this in all kinds of traditions. But these folks, I mean, it's not uncommon in the history of mysticism across cultures as well for people to have, you know, this sort of great humility in the face of the infinite, but not so much humility in the face of their co-religionists at their time. So there's a lot of, we are the inner circle, we are the chabura, the kind of like the holy society of practitioners that are really doing all these wonderful things. But they're not always or ever so praiseworthy of those sort of more conventional types. I mean, you know, the idea that we transcend the ego in a mystical practice is one of the most most classic of ego traps, because then you can say, oh, those people aren't as good as us because we're beyond. So those kinds of things, you'll find that in the Zohar as well. But they're innovating, you know, and they're sowing new seeds.
That's really fascinating. I really love this conversation. There's so many other questions that I did have about your professional career and your routine, and maybe your practice on your study of the Torah. Do you do it at the same time every day? What is your ritual, and how are you continuing to develop this idea of the perfection of your personality through the traditions of studying Torah?
Well, they as they say there's an old Hebrew saying, al regel echat, on one foot, because I have to go in a moment. But on one foot, my greatest personal growth has come from teachers who have pointed me towards practices, grounding practices, especially. I have a lot of head center and a lot of, you know, soul drawing the calls, and I needed to learn about the body and the emotions very, very seriously. And you know, the teachers have really helped me with that, and body-centered introspection has been a big part of that. But in the sum total, it's really, if you can imagine, like this sort of the theme that's run through a lot of today is this: what does it mean to find meaning in, or to probe the depths of reality. And that can mean a book, and that can mean my body, and that can mean my emotions. It can mean relationships. It can mean my city that I'm in. What does it mean to kind of approach reality and see what's lying beneath the surface? Because that, whatever, there's always a wisdom there. And when we can meet it with presence, and we have to be settled enough to be able to do that. If someone's, having a lot going on in their nervous system and they're not able to be settled, this isn't going to work. What's next for that person is just getting settled and calm and grounded enough to even do that work. But then it's really just approaching, like, and what's arising here. And I believe there's a wisdom in reality that it said before the Torah was given on Mount Sinai to Moses, it already existed in the world itself. That there was this universal wisdom which the infinite used or shone through in order to kind of create reality itself. So any moment, any interaction has a potential for that deeper essence to manifest. And I just, broadly speaking, on one foot, it's about contending with, and through that process, knots are going to get untied. Things are going to come through in us, in our relationships, in our texts, in our understandings. But it's all of those levels, depending on what's needed in the moment.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Rabbi Matthew Ponak. I really appreciate your time. I think it's really amazing how enthusiastic and really this is just coming from such a genuine, heartfelt place from you. I can feel it on this side. I hope everybody can hear it and feel it as well. And thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Travis. Wishing you all the best.
I just had a wonderful conversation with my friend Matthew Ponak about Jewish mysticism and his new book, Embodied Kabbalah, Jewish Mysticism for All People. Touching infinity with your feet planted in ordinary reality, this is the goal of Jewish mysticism. Doesn't that resonate? If that resonates with you as much as it does me, you need to check out this conversation. Comment, like, share, subscribe. Thank you.